Hi, Sharon. Hello, Sharon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
I wanted to check if those are all the participants. So should we start or should we give them some more time?
I think we should probably start.
Okay. All right. Okay. So welcome everyone. Good afternoon and good evening from wherever you are joining us. We hope you are keeping safe, and I hope I'm audible enough. You can hear me. Welcome once again. My name is Anne Omamo. I am the program officer at AWAD, African Women in Agricultural Research and Development. And I coordinate mentoring programs, including the AWAD ICWAE mentoring program. And I'm here today on behalf of the AWAD Deputy Director, Dr. Michelle Mboshwao, who is unable to join us, unfortunately, today due to unforeseen circumstances. So she sends her apologies. Just a brief remark. About 1.5 years ago, AWAD collaborated with IFPRI on different capacity development activities, and specifically the mentoring program for women in agricultural economics in the Global South. And this recognizing that there is a critical role in empowering women through capacity building opportunities to help them to achieve greater impact in agriculture and rural development. So through this program, we are building a pool of women in agricultural economics, providing them with the skills and networks so that they can succeed and also move up the ladder. So in addition to the mentoring program, AWAD has also collaborated with the ICWAE leadership team on a set of webinar series. So we can have conversations around issues to do with climate change and environmental economics. So today we are having our second webinar series, and I am happy to invite Professor Cheryl, who will moderate the rest of the session. So Cheryl, if you can hear me, welcome and take it over.
Great, thank you so much, Anne. And we're really excited to be hosting this, this webinar. Let me just note that there are 2 more in this series that will be coming up. First on September 28th, so we're taking a break over July and August. Professor Suwaida Tassi Liverpool at Michigan State University is going to be talking about, can actors in the midstream of food supply chains improve smallholder welfare? Empirical evidence from sub-Saharan Africa. And then on October 12th, I'm going to be giving a webinar looking at what contributions can feminist economics make to agricultural economics. So stay tuned for those coming up later this year. So today I want to introduce, I'm just going to do a brief introduction because there's lots of information on the flyer that went out, but to introduce Dr. Claudia Ringler, who's the Director of Natural Resources and Resilience in the Transformation Strategies Department at IFPRI. I think names keep getting longer and longer of all of everybody's title over time. She has done just an amazing amount of work, really looking at research on the intersection of nature, agriculture, and development. Lots of work on equitable and resilient food systems, including on food and water systems and climate change. So we're really excited to have her here today to talk to us. Let me just say that you're welcome to put things in the chat as we go along if you want to have a conversation with each other. If you have questions for Claudia, please put them in the Q&A little box instead. I will be monitoring those. If you have questions, kind of clarification questions as we go along, I'll try to find a moment and ask her those. Otherwise, we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So again, please put any questions for Claudia in the Q&A, but you're welcome to chat with each other in the chat. So Claudia.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me, anyway, thank you very much first for the
invitation to present to award fellows. I was a mentor, even, I guess the mentorship that I didn't get to its full completion for various reasons, but yeah, it was a very interesting experience, and I think it's an excellent program. And I'm just, glad to be part of it. And yeah, and I'm looking forward to some engagement on the important topic of reaching women with climate resilience strategies. And let me see if I can, it says I can't share my screen while another participant is sharing. So something happened compared to our test that we did a little while ago. So if you can help me, allow me to share my screen. Yeah, unfortunately, it currently says I can't. Yeah, but anyway, as soon as I am able to share my screen, I hope to basically share some of the experiences of one project that we did work on, trying to see how we can do better on reaching women here with climate smart agriculture, practices. And of course, that in itself is a term we could discuss about a lot. And I think the sharing is now working. And yeah, just so introduction, this is really a project that operated unfortunately largely during COVID-19, I think, which is one of the biggest challenges that we faced. But we were able to work with partners in 3 countries. And you can see here, Roots Kenya from Kenya, Self-Employed Women's Association, headquartered in Gujarat, India. Those are 2 grassroots women's organizations. And I think that was a very big goal to work with and through them. And I think one of the main messages over decades of research on how to improve outcomes for women is that women's self-help groups and grassroots women's organizations have to play a key role there. And so I think that's why we decided to directly engage through them. And then we also worked with IFPRI, which is an organization or an institute linked to Makerere University, but most directly, we actually work with the Extension Service of the Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry, and I think it's at Fisheries in Uganda. And we also had a knowledge and capacity support partner with the University of Hohenheim, and they were able to support PhD studies and many master studies as part of this intervention. So, but to some, again, we basically worked in 3 countries. But so why, why do we want to reach women specifically with climate resilience strategies, and why actually do we work on gender? I think the first is, that as you all know, there is currently no gender equality or equity on many different domains. And so, if we do not consider gender topics and gendered issues, we might actually widen the gender gap in achievements. And so considering how men and women benefit or not from interventions such as climate smart agriculture, we actually need to understand who is adopting and who is benefiting from programs and who is not. So this helps us to support social inclusions and gender equality. And then one thing is nothing might happen. So the gender gap might stay exactly the same if we do an intervention or program, but you actually might harm outcomes for men or for women, for example, by increasing their labor burden, increasing their responsibilities without increasing rights. And so that's why it's important to understand, to work on gender and to consider differential impacts. So because we want to mitigate potential harm. And of course, women are about half of the globe's population. So, if we want to enhance program effectiveness and impact, we need to understand how women can contribute to a certain outcome and how men can contribute to a certain outcome. We don't want to only focus on household heads, because then our programs might just not be as effective and as impactful as they could be. And then, of course, if we consider gendered topics, we can also achieve co-benefits and other development outcomes. which is, I think, for, again, focus on women here, we know that, they have certain responsibilities around health, nutrition, care, also resilience. And so if we consider how they're also linked into, if we can consider how an intervention can support them achieving other development outcomes such as nutrition and health, then we can intentionally, shape programs to achieve actually multiple development outcomes. And again, we can only do that if we understand how women and men are, how they fare and how they are, how their social relations and how the norms and traditions and their roles are intertwined with any of these programs that we are trying to support. So the motivation for this particular program, where we worked with the partners I've already mentioned, is the overall, I think don't need to say much about that, increased adverse impacts of climate change, which threatens production, food security, and livelihoods everywhere in the world. So this is not just limited to low and middle income countries, but obviously many impacts are magnified there because capacity to adapt is lower. Then, the terminology of climate smart agriculture, as I said, is a little bit controversial. But, it's at least the intention, I think, is quite good. A set of guiding principles, they're trying to support climate resilience through these 3 pillars: increasing agricultural productivity and incomes. You can also say, profitability, whatever it is. I mean, it makes only sense to support this kind of, to support climate resilience if you, don't get worse off in terms of income. And profitability, productivity. Second, of course, we want to build resilience, or basically achieve adaptation. We want to adapt to the changing climate, and to the extent feasible, so that's why it's also stated where possible, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And in the low and middle income country context, what that often means is emissions per unit of output. So emissions per unit of output are often high, let's say milk production in low and middle income countries, because we don't have very intensive production systems, not very intensive feeding systems. Whereas in high income countries, people talk about, industrial agriculture, it's bad. But in fact, from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, industrial agriculture is doing much better because their emissions per unit of output, be it milk or maize yield, whatever it is per unit of output, their emissions are much lower. So that's why reduction of emissions doesn't mean, you can't have your cows anymore. What it means is you have to become more productive, try to be increase, outputs. And so that is obviously, I think, in the interest of everyone, everywhere. And then there's this, long-term question of what prevents the adoption of climate smart agriculture. And it's not, just climate smart ag, obviously other technologies that might not have been developed to address climate change challenges, but we know that there's many gaps or many reasons or many justifications of why practices and technologies are not being adopted. And literature, has found a whole bunch of reasons, like lack of access to credit, but also lack of access to information. So that has been actually shown as a major challenge, particularly for women farmers. So there's a bunch of literature out there, but ourselves, we had a previous project where we looked at the adoption of various climate resilient strategies or climate smart agricultural practices, and then we found that awareness of women farmers was generally lower. And then we saw that at least for some practices that fall in women's domains, if they had equivalent information that men had access to, we saw equivalent or even higher adoption. And so basically, because of that, we said, okay, we should actually do an information intervention that only, that focuses on this information gap that exists between women and men farmers. Pretty much, I think, almost everywhere in the world, not everywhere, but pretty much, and especially in low and middle income countries. And of course, if you focus on the information gap, then you might still have other gaps, right? There's a time gap, there's the, as I said, credit access gap. So, you know, it's not a bundled intervention for various reasons. I think cost reasons was very much part of it. So we couldn't also, we couldn't like also provide credit and other things. But we said, okay, let's focus on information alone. And the specific intervention, again, you can provide information in many ways. You can send a message over the phone. You can, have extension, change how the traditional extension service operates. In this case, we did participatory videos showing climate smart practices that were selected by women farmers, but we also consulted men farmers, and they were implemented by women farmers. So the videos, they basically only, they show women implementing the practices. So to support this intervention, we did gendered qualitative focus group discussions with farmers and some key informant interviews, and also literature review. And then, of course, we also relied on the knowledge, of the partners. So, this is not us saying this is what you need to do, or this is the practice we think is best, but, really our partners had a very strong role in deciding which practices they felt made most sense to show in the videos, obviously, but still led by the qualitative focus group discussions. And then we also did a baseline and endline survey in the 3 countries to assess the impact of the intervention. In Uganda, we worked in 6 districts in the central region, areas selected by the partner, but includes the 3 richest and the 3 poorest districts in that region. Then in the other 2 countries, as we mentioned, were these grassroots women's organizations. And so, Groots just said those are 3 counties we work on very deeply. So that's the counties they wanted to focus on. And SEVA, basically SEVA actually only wanted to work with SEVA farmers. So they have 1.2 million women farmer members. So obviously they had a lot of people to draw on and to work with. And so they did not want to work with farmers who were not part of their organization. And so that's led to the selection of the locations there. And so just to understand what we tried to do, some kind of impact diagram, so to say, the idea is women farmers receive information on climate smart agriculture. And the first question really is, do you show the information only to women? Do you show the information to women in their home? Who is on the video? Should it be a woman and a man, or only a man, because maybe they're trusted of knowing more, or should it just be a woman? And so, other research at IFPRI and elsewhere, I think already suggested that if we want a change in women's adoption of climate smart agriculture practices, it works best if only the woman is shown in the video. There's also other evidence that already showed that showing such a video at home in a home setting is not leading to the same impact as showing such videos in a group setting. And so that's basically, we just did the same. We didn't test these elements. There was already evidence that just having the woman on the video works better in terms of women's likelihood of changing adoption practices, and the group setting was also very important. The idea is that such an information intervention would increase awareness of the practices, potentially knowledge of the practices. To do that, there is a knowledge test that we developed. Knowledge tests, I think, have their own challenges. And sometimes I think the questions we put were maybe very difficult. I think most of us couldn't have answered them, but fine. And then the idea is, more awareness, more knowledge, and then you can see changes in adoption of practices on plots. That's also a question on plots managed by women, on plots managed jointly, even maybe on plots managed by men. That could then lead to various other impacts, changes in yields on women's plots, changes in various aspects of women's empowerment, changes in income controlled by women, changes in resilience indicators. So those are kind of the idea. But we also understood, even if you have awareness and knowledge, it really doesn't mean that you will adopt for various reasons. The practice might not work on your plot. There's finance issues, there's water challenges, you might not have a market, you might not have tenure, etc. So yeah, really, your expectations shouldn't be too high. Now I'm just will share a few results from a few of the areas, like not from all countries and all types of activities, because that could go on for a very long time. But just to mention again, things were done somewhat differently in the 3 countries because we really wanted the partners were taking a lot of the decisions and how the research was done. In Kenya, we did traditional focus group discussions, and in fact, they were done with also younger and elder men and women. And here on the left, I mean, first, there were some questions on what were the main climate change related challenges they faced. And then you can see droughts and heavy rains, like in the left quadrant, were mentioned most often as climate change related challenges. And then there was a question on adaptation strategies that they were already doing or considering. And you can see a lot related to water, unsurprisingly, linked to drought, drilling boreholes, water harvesting, micro irrigation, but also interestingly storing food, desilting, and desilting dams is another water one, mulching to preserve soil moisture. But then heavy rains, so it's really the extremes, right, that people experience. Not higher temperature wasn't considered. I guess it's very difficult to really experience higher temperature once you're always in the same location because it's such a small increase. But heavy rains, I guess fewer adaptation strategies, but cover crops, trenches, etc. So those are some of the practices that were mentioned. Then resources needed, and then there's this question: who can actually access these resources? What are constraints to accessing the resources? And then what are some solutions? And you can see education, which building capacity, and obviously could also basically links to this whole information question, was surprisingly mentioned quite often. Even so, lack of money, was mentioned, and of course lack of knowledge. So yeah, basically all of that suggests that maybe information intervention is not such a bad idea. In terms of differences between genders, there were some, like I think men were more likely to mention this tree planting and the bigger interventions like desilting dams and irrigation kind of interventions. So women were more likely to mention mulching, also food storage, etc. So clearly there are some gendered roles linked to some of those responses. Then the constraints, they were already in the previous graph, but they're just highlighted here, now separated by the types of focus group discussions. You can see lack of money, there's agreement across all genders that's a challenge. But you can see, for example, lack of land and space was not mentioned by elder men, but much more likely to be mentioned by women and obviously the younger folks. Lack of, interestingly, weather updates is something that the younger men focus slightly more on, or mention slightly more off. So you can see there are a few gendered and age-related differences, but not quite dramatic, because in these focus group discussions you talk for a while and things do come up eventually across all of them. And then in terms of, again, the kind of support that they were looking for, financial support almost across the board. Interestingly, education capacity building slightly more often mentioned by elder women and men. Machinery and equipment, interest by younger, actually by everyone but elder women. And then again, climate weather updates. We also, in all of the focus group discussions in the 3 countries, we focused on the CSA component, and we focused on the information sources component. And then again, you can see, traditional information sources such as, I guess, radio to some extent, television to some extent, I think, come up, plus obviously the formal channels like agriculture extension, but family community meetings. And in fact, if you tally everything, you will see that so-called informal sources of information, they come up on top over more formal sources of information. So I'm saying family, community meetings, barasas, etc. I think they're at least quite often used by women farmers, and also farmer to farmer, friends and neighbor meetings. So it's very clear. Again, I think that group-based meetings are very important. Print is definitely not something anyone really uses anymore, even in Kenya. But at the same time, more the so-called ICT measures, internet, social media, SMS is also really not used yet, at least by poorer farmers. There's a lot of research out there, that shows all kinds of great benefits from having access to ICT. I think I've even recently heard a colleague saying that if women had mobile phones, they were more likely to achieve similar market prices when they were like selling goods in a market, as men. So now there could be a whole bunch of reasons why that is there. So we believe very strongly that ICT is very important. Findings basically point to that. But at the same time, we have to be aware, that most poorer women and men farmers currently do not have access to modern ICT. This is still a reality. And that's why, especially during COVID-19, after COVID-19, there was huge push, towards focus yet more on ICT tools. And obviously it's an area, that this project worked on, but we just cannot, change reality. And reality is that if you're serious about reaching poor women and men farmers, it's unlikely we will not do so. We will reach farmers for sure, but not necessarily the poorest. Anyway, yeah, then, so what did we finally come up with and come out with in terms of the practices that were promoted in the intervention? And to you, they might not necessarily all sound like climate smart practices a priori, which is also why it was a little bit challenging for us to assess mitigation impacts. Like one thing we wanted to do was to do a nice assessment of mitigation impacts of the practices, but they were just not lending themselves as much to that. So in India, they did soil health testing. You can, it's obviously clear. I think for all of these practices, you can find out you can make the linkages to CSA, right? The 3 pillars, productivity, adaptation, mitigation for all of the practices, right? Soil health testing links to improved fertilizer application, soil fertility. So I think it's clear, but it's not necessarily so easy to say, this saves you so much on greenhouse gas emissions, etc., or you'll survive the next drought because you implemented soil health testing. So it's not so easy. Some of those practices, integrated pest management, same thing. You can find the linkage to the pillars, but you can't just calculate your emissions reductions as easily, because in the end it depends. These practices are implemented quite differently, different crops, different farms. Biopesticide, right? Another one. You substitute chemical pesticides with own produced pesticides. Like there's a lot of cow urine, all kinds of concoctions were suggested by the farmers. But again, it's a bit difficult to assess it. In Uganda, interestingly, there was a focus on livestock. That's all in all a very good idea if you do want to reach women farmers. In fact, even in India, in Gujarat, they have they're generally responsible for dairy, the women farmers, but they didn't. The focus, interestingly, has been on crops. Uganda, there has been a strong focus on livestock, so climate smart pig management, climate smart poultry management, and then there's again this question: what makes poultry management climate smart? And so they came up with a whole set of ideas. So again, this is not from us. This was the Extension Service, and together with farmers, and actually they were visiting, farmers who had implemented, somewhat more advanced practices, and then they're featured in the movies. in the videos. All of these videos are on YouTube, so and we'll share the slide deck if you want to watch them. They also have soil and water management and also integrated pest management, which is obviously quite different from India. So I think it's also interesting to see. In Kenya, they focus, I think, almost to some extent more on the counties rather than on the practice. So while there is a focus on zero till in Nakuru, there's a whole bunch of other things that are shown in the video. For Laikipia, the side pits was the intervention. I think that is the one intervention that is quite distinguishable in Kenya. But then in Busia, it was conservation ag, and there's again, I can see that it's a mix. Zero till and conservation agriculture. Those two videos have a lot of practices shown. So this is what happened on the videos. And I just wanted to share a few pictures here. This is in India, so SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association, as I've mentioned, 1.2 million farmer members. They pay an extremely low membership fee, and there's a whole bunch of interventions they're doing, but they have a very big agricultural program. And so in India, they actually decided to go beyond videos. They also wanted to show posters. So on the left, you see a poster intervention, and on the right, you see the video intervention. And you can also already see a challenge here. They decided to go with tablets, for various reasons, electricity access, ease of, then they can basically show the tablets. Each of the women then also can hold the tablet. And they've also, what they did in India is they did an immediate little knowledge test right after showing the videos. That was not done elsewhere because no one else used tablets. So different ways of implementing the intervention. Here, Uganda, as you can see, so the India picture that you see here was actually after, I'm not saying after, it's hard to say when is after COVID, but India basically was lagging behind about 2 years, because of the severity of the COVID-19 related impacts. And also they had more women farmers to work with. Our project required that we reach tens of thousands of farmers with our interventions. And in India, they were reaching 33,000 farmers. So obviously our survey reached a small number, but their job was to reach more than 30,000 farmers with these interventions. And so, they were basically 2 years behind. In Sub-Saharan Africa, we could start earlier with the intervention, and so that's why you can also see no masks here. But there were huge restrictions, of course. Generally trying to show the videos outside, which was a challenge. There were limits on the number of farmers you could bring together because of the COVID-19 restrictions. Huge restrictions, throughout the entire intervention. So not the ideal thing to do during COVID-19, but we tried to do it. That's another showing in Uganda, and you can see here they used a cloth to try to develop a screen. So that lots of issues on how to do this kind of field work. Now we had then master's students who studied at the University of Hohenheim, who went to the field during or after the videos were shown, and they had other focus group discussions to understand how the videos were perceived by farmers. And these are just some findings. It's just from a master's student who actually just finished in India, and so I just threw some of her slides in. So she put convenience, where do you do the training sessions or the video interventions, what's the timing, and of course SEVA is very much on top of what works because they're doing a lot of training on a lot of topics. They always do it in the villages, small groups, of course, various reasons, local language, obviously everything was done in local language. Community connection, trust. Those are all elements that are very important if we want to make a difference. And I think our partners were very good in that. One or two, little, sound bites. Other agencies are not providing information to us. yeah, and then in fact we heard that interestingly, you know, I remember seeing a similar quote in Kenya. I mean, here this is, I don't know who KVK is in India, but they show videos on farming, but often to men only. I don't know what that is, but in Kenya, we did hear that there's a lot of NGOs and so forth coming to villages, and they say that they want to do something. They want to work with farmers on capacity building, whatever it is. And in the Kenyan settings where I went also to the field, basically the women just said, you know, if they come in and they say they want to talk to farmers, we know it's not us. And then the women do not show up because they say farmers, and women even in India and in Kenya, they don't see themselves as farmers. They think when they say farmers, they want only to talk to the men. So there's still, it's surprising, you know, we've had decades of work on gender, and it's still a desegregated situation. Yeah, then the timing, it's a quote on timing. Yeah, and then, oh yeah, another big, I think, issue that came up in all of the findings from the master thesis that accompanied or went after the video interventions was completed is that, you know, you show some videos on some practices, but, you know, often the women and men who actually come to the video showings, they have other issues, other topics. And so many other practices actually came up, and you know, and those practices maybe were of more interest or happened to be more important at the time. I went to a district in India as well, and they said, you know, those videos were all interesting, but we have no water right now. It's a very bad. I mean, as you might all be aware, extreme heat stress right now in every year, so to say, in northern India. And they just said, you know, we can't implement any of these practices because we can't grow any crops right now. Or in Kenya, they said, sorry, we have elephant damage right now. So, you know, these practices sound interesting, but we have other problems. So again, this is just very important. Yeah, very important to be aware. You know, you think you find a practice that might be suitable, but it might just not work for most farmers for various reasons. But that doesn't mean that the intervention itself didn't have other beneficial impacts. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so this is just another outcome from India. Now on these surveys, so we also, as I mentioned, we did baseline and endline surveys where we try to, you know, assess the impact of the interventions. And so just 2-3 slides before I close. This is, I think, the baseline, the gender gap in awareness of some of those strategies. And you can see awareness of practices is generally higher for men, with the only difference, the only practice where women had higher awareness was improved pig management. So here it's called improved. I mean, we can call it climate smarter improved. And then in terms of you know, sources of information, we did ask in the qualitative study, and then we of course also asked in the quantitative study. And again, there are some information gaps, and of course also changes changes in information sources, and then the gap between women and men accessing these sources in the baseline and in the end line. So we see, for example, a little bit increase in access to religious organizations between baseline and end line of women, but much higher, interestingly, changes and improvements in men's use of information sources for climate resilience strategies in the end line. So women seem to either not have changed much, or basically the difference is not significant. And of course, again, overall quite substantial, larger set of information sources of men. Sorry. And then also the constraints to the adoption of resilience strategies, you know, again, very similar between qualitative and quantitative. And then more women and men identify constraints to the adoption of strategies. Lack of funds, same as I think came out in a qualitative study. Lack of information is substantial. So that's, you know, focusing on information is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not the number one source. And then we did maybe just to almost conclude, women videos had some adoption impacts. So a little bit improvement in soil bonds, some water management, manure management, and improved pasture management. So, for example, improved pasture management was not something that we showed on the videos, but probably came up during the discussions following the showing of the videos. There was, we had to look at both women and men who actually watched the videos and those who were intended to treat. As part of the whole COVID-19 challenge, we had actually quite low adherence. COVID-19 challenge and working with grassroots organizations, I'd say, we had much more limited adherence to the numbers, of the control farm intervention farmers, who were supposed to watch the video compared to who actually saw the videos for various reasons. So just to conclude, I think our intervention showed that there is certainly some improvement in some practices. Often actually not awareness, because if we recall the videos that we put out there, a lot of farmers were aware, and of course they all know there's pig management and poultry management, but then they might not exactly know that what makes them climate smart. So there's also the question of what awareness, how do you define it for these very complex practices? We do see some increased adoption, but I think in Kenya we found no statistically significant increase in adoption, but again, very low adherence. I think only about 20 to 30% adherence of the farmers who were supposed to watch the videos who actually watched the videos. And then we did see some findings in land constraints that affected the likelihood of adoption. Even so, we really tried to identify practices where you did not need access to finance. Of course, you do need some access to land. So videos similar to other interventions are not panacea, but they can be an additional solution. They were adopted by the e-platform, Ministry of Agriculture in Uganda. Video streaming equipment was purchased by one of our districts in Uganda because they really liked the videos. In India, they're planning to roll those videos out, not just to the 30,000 women who have already seen them, or 34,000, but beyond. And then the kind of approaches used in this project were already successfully re-marketed by our Kenyan partner, and I think they now have some other projects that are using similar approaches. Constraints, COVID-19, it was a very big challenge. And there's also challenges of implementing videos not linked to COVID-19. And as I mentioned, we achieved huge depth and just very different way of working by working with grassroots women's organizations and the extension service. But the targeting, compliance, and various of these things was very challenging as a result. And I'm happy to discuss any of these topics, and I hope my timing was not too bad. And thanks so much for listening to this. And we have a whole bunch of literature and other things that I can also share if there is interest. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Claudia. So let me encourage people to put questions or anything you want to ask Claudia in the Q&A. We've just had one question so far, and I have some. So, but somebody was wondering a little bit more detail about where you were working in Kenya.
I think when I showed the video slide, it was clear: Nakuru, Busia, and Laikipia. Those are areas where Roots Kenya is very active. And then Roots Kenya was interested to include Roots farmers, so to say. So those are farmers who are already linked to Roots through WhatsApp groups. They have champion farmers who basically manage groups of farmers. And they were also open to that we work with non-Roots farmers. But they basically selected those locations, various reasons, different agroecological zones, obviously that they're operating there. And for each of the places we had some criteria, but mostly really defined by the partners. But that was basically the specific situation in Kenya.
Great. All right, let me keep encouraging people to ask questions, but I have one. So Claudia, I've been working on issues around technology adoption for many, many years. And I'm wondering what's different now that we're thinking about it in terms of climate change? How does putting a kind of a climate change lens on these kinds of issues change either what we're doing or how we're doing it?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and I think I should really put something together that summarizes it. But just some thoughts. I mean, the first one is, and also something from working on CSA for 15 years or so, a bit more. So what we feel very strongly about is that adoption of CSA is linked to perception of climate change. So if farmers don't think the climate is changing, so they don't think that there are more extreme events or that there's a long-term increase in temperature, which it exists, so we can show it from data. But if farmers don't have a perception that the climate is changing, so they're very unlikely to adopt what we would call a climate smart ag practice. And that is a little bit different from a non-CSA practice, right? Because otherwise you really but you mostly focus on maybe time savings, productivity, however you define it, income, profitability. With something that linked to climate smart, or if you're focusing on technologies that are trying to address climate change or climate action oriented, you're trying to respond to a perception that climate is changing, which is why we always have to bring that in. And then, of course, as I said, mitigation remains a challenging topic, but we've always been trying to, say mitigation is not something that you shouldn't be doing because you're not responsible for climate change. Mitigation is something you should be doing because adverse climate change affects you particularly. And you should only be doing it if it makes economic sense. And it generally makes economic sense because most mitigation practices in Africa, for example, but also in South Asia, they will improve productivity. We talk about intensification. So that's basically, I think, maybe something the main difference of a technology that is supposed to contribute to climate action or climate resilience. And as I said, there's the mitigation piece and there's the adaptation piece. And there's a lot of agencies and so forth that say, no, you should only focus on adaptation. But I would never support that notion, because it doesn't make sense to focus on adaptation strategies that worsen climate change. It shouldn't be in anyone's interest. And that's why you actually need to consider all the three pillars, which is why the concept, people don't like to think smart. For me, climate resilience strategies works equally, but you really have to look at all of these three pillars. Then there's also, there's many other things, right? If it is an accepted climate smart ag practice, you can try to get finance from the carbon market, which you can't if you just say, oh, I'm adopting another seed technology. If you are able to show that it's a term called additionality, that if this particular practice gets adopted, you can make a real contribution to mitigation. You can link to carbon markets and get money for it. And just as an example, which is actually one of the best outcomes from the project, in 2019, when just before COVID, we had our first workshop, and we had participants from SEVA coming in to Cruz, Kenya, and we did some field visits, and Cruz, Kenya was supporting biogas operations. Women farmers, they have cows. They even bought biogas cows, because the electricity for cooking was too high, the cost. And then SEVA had supported a biogas program in the past, and they restarted it because they saw it in Kenya. And the way they were able to do it in India, they got an implementer who put these little biogas operations in for individual women farmers, and the implementer got carbon credits. So because biogas is an accepted practice, you reduce emissions from cow manure, And so the implementer got the credits, the women farmers only paid like a quarter of the cost of the biogas, what it would cost otherwise to install this little system, because the implementer already got the money from the carbon market. And, and so now if that would have been, a non-climate smart practice, sorry, you will not get carbon credits. You will not be able to get it at a quarter of the actual cost. Yeah, so I mean, and as that it goes on, if you keep thinking about it, you'll find some more differences of what makes something a climate smart practice. And of course, mulching and zero till, it's not impossible to get carbon credits, but it's more difficult to get those carbon credits. But there are programs that have been able to avail carbon credits also for these practices. It's just what you get. It's just a couple of dollars per year, so it's not very high, not as high as maybe biogas operation. But you have to think, long term here. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to put the next two questions together because I think they're at least a little bit related. One is asking about whether you've tested any of the impacts on any other outcomes, such as yields or other outcomes apart from adoption. And then the other question, so both of these are kind of technical questions. Could you say a little bit more on the soil testing and were farmers testing soils?
Okay, yeah, I'm trying to my best. So first on, India, we haven't done the impact assessment yet. So the data, as I said, we were basically 2 years behind. The end line data was actually just, data collection just finished in early June, so simply no results yet. But we did have some issues with the data quality of the survey company who did the baseline. So we are a little bit worried on what we'll get by comparing endline and baseline in India. In Kenya, as I think I've been trying to say, we, given the very low compliance of having the intended to treat actually watching the videos, a lot of that is linked to COVID-19, but also I think linked various other things. We were obviously not in the field during the COVID-19 time, and a lot of challenges with things. But so we didn't get statistically significant impact on adoption. And as soon as you don't get that, no analysis was done on any of the other parameters, because as you can see, our linkage, right? You have no adoption, then we don't expect. No statistically significant change in adoption, so we didn't expect impacts on gender yield gaps or women's empowerment. In Uganda, it's a very messy situation. Yes, we did look at gender yield gaps, resilience indicators, women's empowerment. We have some draft papers out there, and we're still discussing econometric strategies. So yes, we have a separate paper that's also published as an IFPRI working paper that already looks at some linkages of gender yield gaps and women's empowerment at different levels of poverty. It's an unusual construct from one of the master's students. And actually the main issue that he grappled with is the definition of a gendered plot, right? Or gendered plot management. And he says, based on the definitions that can be derived from the survey, the gender yield gap to start with, I think, was between 60 and 150%. So basically, he did a paper around that, and then he did separate focus group discussions to try to understand how women consider, gendered plot management. When is a woman in charge, and when is a man in charge? And so that went off in a somewhat different direction. But he has some nice little results. He has been trying to get it into a journal article, but I think he was rejected twice. So we have not been able to put this out. But there is a discussion paper that has at least some of the aspects. I think it doesn't go quite as far as the journal article would in terms of looking at women's empowerment impacts from gendered yield gaps. But that paper just hasn't gone anywhere yet. And then, we do have another one that just looks at climate smart practices and women's empowerment. And again, it's just a super messy relationship there. Yeah. And that one hasn't we haven't actually tried to submit yet. So yeah, we are working on those topics. Also the data, the data are all online. I'm always trying a couple projects. Yeah, so you can also work with the data yourself. So there is the whole Women's Empowerment Index. I mean, all the data are there, apart from India, because as I said, India, we're still working on the end line. But yes, so and as I said, I can put a list together of all of the products that we have done so far. We're currently working on a series of policy notes that just summarize the results across information channels, CSA practices, video interventions, and some of the qualitative studies. Yeah, so that should be available in a few months. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to go look up the one on gendered yield gaps and empowerment. I'm really curious to see what you've done. So the next question notes that women do not seem to see themselves as farmers, and that this is true across Africa, and that after all India. And India as well, right? And other places as well. I think it's true in some of Latin America as well. And we've all been working on these issues for so many years. So the question, it says that after so many years of gender work in the ministries of agriculture in Africa, so what are we doing wrong? Is the question.
I mean, yeah, no, that's a good question. And, this is really a question for you, Cheryl said I work on this topic, yes, but it's not I work on other topics, maybe more so. So it's almost a question to you, right? What are we doing wrong? I mean, the one entry point that works is women's grassroots organizations. Absolutely. I mean, in this project, as I said, we worked with the Ministry of Agriculture in Uganda, and they've tried, right? Women, gender, they've tried. They said 11% of our agents are women. So they recognize that's a problem. They say 70 to 80% of the work done in agriculture is done by women, which may be a little bit too optimistic or too pessimistic, whichever way you see it. But, they understand the basics, but it's obviously not the same. You will not get the same result working with the Extension Service in Uganda as if you work with GROOTS, Kenya, and SEVA. You get different things at different levels, but the understanding of how to engage women and what women want is obviously much higher if you work with grassroots women's organizations. So if you want women to understand themselves as women farmers, you have to work with these organizations. Absolutely. You don't have to, you just look at it. You don't have to know anything, and you get a ministry organization that is run by men. I mean, really, I didn't see a lot of women ministers sitting around in agriculture and so forth. I don't know how many. Anyway, so that alone will make a difference. Really strengthen support to grassroots women's organizations that work with women farmers. That is when you will increase the understanding that women farmers women are farmers, and GROOTS Kenya is also a little bit more politically engaged than SEVA for various reasons. And so GROOTS Kenya, has helped getting some women elected into county governments. And as a result of that, when these counties are trying to come up with some new ag policy, they know that GROOTS Kenya will mobilize the women farmers. Their champion farmers will mobilize all the other women farmers, and they will not be able to pass some legislation, some little county law that does not consider women farmers' needs and aspirations, and they get them elected into. So that, to me, is how change happens. And that is how women will be recognized by county governments as women farmers. So that, I can see across those three countries, it can work. And SEVA does it differently, right? They're not engaging in the political side. But they're extremely effective. During COVID-19, the government had some ideas, or we need to support, but they didn't really know how. And really then SEVA came in and said, this is how. And SEVA was able to actually reach the poorer, the poorer women farmers and families, right? They reached the whole families. And it was very clear that the government just wasn't able to get to that last, whatever, it's not the last mile, it's the last 50 meters, so to say. Yeah. Okay.
Great. I really like that. I like thinking about the role of grassroots organizations, because so often you get this cycle that the women don't see themselves as farmers, and the government and the extension and those folks don't see the women as farmers. And so it's really hard to break that cycle. I think we've done a lot of work over the years trying to get women more visible in the data. And that's true. I think it's much better now than it was, but figuring out how to change both the women's attitudes, helping them realize themselves as farmers at the same time that you're working with the government officials seems like the right way to do this. Looks like you're looking at the questions too. I'm not sure. The next one, I'm not quite sure. It says, please, according to your preliminary data, how many sessions, zone and time, should we hope for a significant CSA practice implementation? So I think that's a question about implementation and what do you have to do to get people to implement them?
Yeah, no, that is a very, very good point. In fact, that I mentioned COVID-19, and we felt one of the reasons of, low adoption. I mean, for example, in Kenya, where we had no significant adoption, we did the baseline before COVID-19, just before. So in like February 2020. Then, as you know, upheaval, I mean, huge migration, return migration into rural areas. There were and basically one video showing in a year and a half. And then we did the end line. So to me, that alone is a very, is a clear indication of why, so we're saying we don't have impact, but we tried, in terms of the adoption. But again, I want to say it doesn't mean that the videos were useless. It was just the context was very challenging. So both SEWA and GROOTS, they work with their own farmers through WhatsApp groups and champion farmers. So, the women farmers don't need to have a smartphone, but the champion farmers usually do. And so there are ways, to strengthen the message over time. And GROOTS, Kenya, and SEWA did that to some extent, to the extent it was feasible during COVID-19. There were many other things they needed to focus on instead. But yes, we believe that continued messaging obviously strengthen the impact and the outcome, but we didn't vary that. We just had to go with the COVID-19 flow, which just we understood that there were other keeping people alive and getting some health supplies to them and health related whatever issues, income, severe income declines, income shocks that the farmers faced. So yeah, clearly the Kenya situation, which was the worst, where we had 1.5 years and one single video showing plus some strengthening through their WhatsApp. So the videos had to be able to be shared, in a WhatsApp kind of format as well. But that we felt that contributed to the challenges faced there. And then, of course, Ministry of Agriculture in Uganda doesn't have this kind of continued contact, and the way they operate is a bit different. Of course, they have these extension agents sitting at the district level, but then the videos were also shown just one time there, and they don't send stuff through smartphones to anyone. So they certainly had much more limits there. But I think the core thing is the group discussion, and you just cannot show the video and that's it. Maybe you can do it if you show it to a second or third time, but you should not just show a video, go to someone's home and show the video, ask your knowledge test, and you think you're done and hope for adoption. You do need the group discussion, because that's when tons of questions came up. And for example, even let's say the climate smart pig management, farmers said, "Oh, this doesn't show all aspects of pig management." Yes, it doesn't, because it's supposed to show what makes it climate smart. It doesn't tell you where to buy your pigs, or that's another issue, the length of the videos, right? But then people asked all these questions to the extension agents or to the GROOTS Kenya or Seva, they ask these additional questions. So how do we do that? And why is that? And then you can just convey much more information. And the farmers talk to each other, oh, I have this experience and I have that experience. And as you remember, the main information channels of farmers is farmers and communities and families. So the video is interesting, but in the end, you know, I think they might have been more likely to change something because they heard it. Oh, they say, oh, and then this other farmer said, yes, we have done it or we haven't done it. And by the way, we didn't, not sure I didn't mention it explicitly, but in our quantitative finding, we asked people, why are you not adopting? And I think one of the graphs that I showed should have shown that. And some people said, we have tried it, it failed. We have tried it, failed. You know, they will not do it again. They've had a bad experience already with either mulching or they tried to do this soil and water. For whatever reason, it didn't work because maybe, you know, the climate situation that year was not conducive to that, or it was too expensive, or whatever it was. So so we also have to be aware that, you know, farmers have already tried a lot of these things and they just felt it fails. It doesn't work on my particular piece of land for whatever reason. So again, we just have to be aware of that as well. I mean, I think a very key thing is a lot of, especially economists, they're trying these singular practices or a bunch of practices, and then they're surprised that there's no adoption. And so, you know, farmers have some reasons why they're not adopting. And then we also did find, you know, we tried to identify practices that we felt women farmers could adopt without getting a loan. And I'm so glad we did that, because imagine COVID-19, it's the last thing they would have gone for a loan for. They had so many other problems, survival, paying very health costs and various other things, mobility constraints. So we would have put in a practice where they would have had to get credit for, would have been even impossible. But we noticed the soil and water intervention in Uganda, you know, they have to dig some serious trenches. And it turned out that, you know, some in the qualitative work after the videos were shown, in the end, some women said, you know, you still have to get some labor for this. I can't do all of these big trenches myself. And they just were not able to do that. And so we still see that even so, those were practices they should have been, we thought they could do. Not all of the women farmers felt that they were actually able to do it. They felt there was still some additional labor or financial resources that they would have had to get access to.
Great. So there's two kind of related questions about getting information out. And somebody notes that in Ecuador, farmers still really want printed information. And so was curious about whether farmers really don't want that kind of information in the places that you've worked. And a related one asking about the impact of the proliferation of vernacular radio stations in Kenya as sources of information. And did people talk about those as sources of information, and how might those work?
Yeah, so print, yeah, I mean, this is interesting. This is just, I mean, I guess that slide that came out there was from the qualitative fieldwork in one country. So you know, print media, I don't think it was seen as negative or of low use necessarily in some of the other countries. But I'm just looking quickly at the quantitative results, and in fact, print is not mentioned at all. So print is just not mentioned. I don't know why. That's Uganda now. And I don't think it was mentioned at all in India either. So yeah, it is interesting. This being said, you know, the qualitative work in India, so some of the farmers said that the posters were clearer to them. I mean, if you look at the picture, I can see why. The posters are huge and the tablet is tiny. But then we did also, in this, the master student also said, the posters are printed, a problem. So many women cannot read them. So of course, in the training, right, they were read. I mean, the information, they're pointing, and they said, a lot of them were pictures too. I mean, the one I think in the picture showed quite a bit of text, but a lot of them were just pictures. So there is definitely still a literacy challenge with any printed media. So there are definitely women who absolutely can't read these things. So that I think remains a challenge. There's a gender gap in education and literacy in the 3 countries between women and men. This being said, yeah, having something, you know, that's you can refer back to in your home is probably also not a bad thing. But yeah, printed media simply didn't come up much. Radio, we did some end workshops in the countries. And radio, we discussed for a very long time in Uganda, because there's a lot of investment, I think Farm Radio International, etc. Lots of these radio shows, also television shows. And in Uganda, in the quantitative field work, radio was simply not a media used by women for climate smart agriculture. We also, by the way, we did ask, what are you using for information? And then we asked, what do you use for climate smart if you want to learn about some new technologies that help you address climate change? So we asked the question separately, at least in 2 of the countries, and the responses were different. And in Uganda, women simply almost, I think it was 3% of women who said they, radio is a source when they think about information on climate smart agriculture, or climate resilience, whichever way we try to formulate it in an easy way. And then there was this big discussion in the workshop in Uganda, and people said, why, there's new radio shows that focus on climate change. And then there was this, I think, woman from CARE, and she's like, the farms I visit, and some of them, the man in the morning, he takes the batteries out of the radio when he goes to the field, and he says he doesn't want his wife to waste her time listening to cooking shows and shows that try to sell you stuff. So maybe some women just don't have access to the radio. The radio is there, but the batteries are gone. And then, I think a lot of them just said, yes, women certainly use radio as a source of information, but it's just other information, right? It's cooking, it's all kinds of other information that might be of use to them, but it's just not climate smart agriculture. And then they said, if this Farm Radio International, I think they were in the room, they said if they'll do a very serious campaign, around outreach campaign before they put up their climate change radio show, climate change action radio show, whatever they wanted to do, then they might be able to get women. And then you have to look at the timing, what time of the day, would you put that thing out? And then women, if you then go back in a couple of years and you try it again, if that thing was a serious intervention, they might actually then find that women use radio as a source of information for climate smart ag. But we didn't, right? It was not something they were thinking of. We were like, so what is your information channel? You look for information on climate change. So it's family, community, whatever, but not radio, at least certainly not in Uganda. And not in our sample, right? I mean, we had this 6 districts, who knows, maybe somewhere else. But there was a big discussion point, to what extent radio can serve this purpose. And I guess it can if it's done well, right? I'm not saying it's not possible. And there is this challenge, as I said, COVID-19 has removed a lot of resources from households. We've also heard in India, we did separate phone surveys, linking on access to information during COVID-19, just using some of the funds. And, women, if there were 2 phones, women's phones, there was no more data was purchased. Or, the basically challenges of expenditures on anything, mobility, and obviously extension people also didn't show up. So that everything worsened. And that means people relied usually even more so on traditional and family as sources of information on climate change. And there is this question, will it get back? When will it get back to the pre-COVID level? The income situation certainly hasn't gone back because of the food inflation that's going on right now, and the energy price inflation, fertilizer price inflation. So people are still very much on the margin there, and which again, tells me that the more local you can provide information, the better. But of course, at least there have to be some people in the locality with the information, and then that gets you right back to the grassroots women's organization. That even so, they also, of course, also resource constrained. But at least they're, often working, really directly in the villages.
Good. We've got a question that relates back to COVID. I'm not sure this is a big question, not necessarily that comes out of your research, but the question is, pandemics like COVID-19 can unwittingly use vulnerable groups like women as a catapult to have an even bigger impact on the national burden of the disease. Did you isolate key recommendations that can help in building the resilience among women to reposition themselves in a productive way during the crisis? and perhaps even after the crisis?
Okay. I mean, it's a very good question. So I mean, we saw all kinds of things, and I don't think I can answer the question very well, but just a few tidbits of data that we collected. So obviously, as I mentioned, we had a lot of return migration, right, during COVID-19 from urban areas back into rural areas. So a lot of men, more men than women returning, right, because more men than women had been gone to make money in urban areas or even abroad. So that, or sometimes they didn't return, but they didn't send money anymore. So we saw a huge, reduction in remittances that came into female-headed households, even there was no return of men. So yeah, to what extent did women reassert themselves during that? I mean, I think we couldn't fully tease out in this work to what extent men took over women's remunerative activities in rural areas during that time. We know that women's care burden increased much more than men's care burden during that period. Of course, more people showing up in rural areas, but obviously if anyone is sick, there's no school. Someone has to take care of all those little kids or not so little kids that are suddenly around. So yeah, kind of difficult in terms of reassert yourself. So, and mobility, again, if someone was able to go anywhere, I think there was at least one case, I think, where just women could go on certain days. And then, yes, women, might have had some more rights because they were allowed to leave the house during COVID-19. But all in all, again, the mobility gap, when you are more resource constrained, there's already a mobility gap that women are less likely to go out of the house, and you have no money, then the likelihood that a woman will go out of the house has further declined. So yeah, reassert yourself. I mean, then also which assets were liquidated when they had to rely on savings, then they had to sell their stuff, had to borrow money. Most, again, past research, suggest that they've obviously, farmers don't want to sell their land, right, to survive. So they'll try to sell pretty much everything else first. And women's assets, that are generally less tied to land than men's assets and things that can be sold. So again, it's basically has been a challenge for women because their assets might have been sold first or equally. Everyone has been borrowing. A lot of men actually died. I'm sorry, I don't know the final research there, but some people did say that in some locations more men than women died. I don't know enough of that, but so yeah, it's very difficult to reassert yourself in this situation. And again, looking. I mean, generating income in agriculture is one way, but obviously generating income outside agriculture is often a better way for women, during this kind of crisis. So if you have anything else, have a little shop to sell home-cooked food, any other activity that you can do without mobility and very little savings that you can fall upon. That's what they did. And again, as I said, these grassroots women's organizations, I think, were very important there to identify means, because there were support services, right? There were some transfers from government, some transfers from NGOs. But again, the perception, I don't think we've done a very great quantitative study on that, but the perception has been that if women were linked to such grassroots organizations, they were more likely to access them because those organizations know of these opportunities that exist for women farmers. The women farmers generally don't know. Or we were told by farmers pretty much everywhere that the subsidy schemes on fertilizers, etc., they came up more, closer to the Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine crisis, where fertilizer prices have increased. They didn't support the subsidy schemes because women farmers did not get access to the subsidies. Because you had to fill in a bunch of paperwork, you had to have be on the land title, and so they felt there was a waste of money for what concerns them. they certainly don't like fertilizer subsidies. So there's a lot of programs that don't work for women, and somehow governments and donors don't care to listen. I think we've been trying to make that case, that people we work with say, sorry, these subsidies are not friendly, not women friendly at all. And they should, if they actually grow the gender gap in access to resources. It doesn't mean, of course, that from a household perspective, it might not be such a bad idea to get the man gets access to the fertilizer, but even that was not very likely, right, for the poorer farmers. So I'm not sure if I was very helpful here, but the picture overall is a little bit bleak, and as that women self-help groups, programs that directly targeted women. I mean, sorry, and there were some programs, maybe it was all a bit too negative. There were some programs that procured food procurement programs that, for example, procured food from women farmers for all kinds of things. For example, say a poultry factory that said, okay, we are buying grains, but we want 50% of the farmers where we purchase from have to be women farmers, or providing, I think, some storage devices to women. As you know, food storage is a big area where women have particular responsibility. So there were some programs that provided storage device support, either against aflatoxin or whatever it is. In this food price inflation and food access challenge situation, having better storage opportunities is a key intervention area that actually can be very useful. And so that, for example, is a program that actually then strengthened women's access to resources, because I think men understood, these storage devices, this is a women's job. So they got these devices when the programs were able to reach women. So some areas are positive, and then many areas were really not so positive for women.
Great. We've got a few more minutes and a couple questions. One of them is noting that providing information to farmers is very good, but that adoption is dependent on a lot of other things, including the availability of funds. And how do we think about resolving some of these other ones, particularly providing credit for women farmers?
Yeah, exactly. So that, they would have had more resources or more time or whatever. I think that kind of a bundled innovation package, which is, what I think what a lot of people talk about is the way to go. It is to provide access to credit. There's again many ways to do that. A colleague of mine has a project called risk contingent credit, where banks, so it directly works with agricultural banks in some African countries, and they have a reinsurance scheme going, where when the farmers default the credit or the loan they get from the bank itself has assurances to recover the funds from yet another organization, and that could be government, it could be a reinsurance company. I think the program that they started with, they had some reinsurance companies that were willing to invest to reinsure some of the credit volume that was going to farmers that were using these funds for some, I'm not even sure if all of them were necessarily, I guess, again, you can construe them to be climate smart agriculture practices. I think so that those are some of the schemes that should be supported more, because, rather than farmers don't necessarily have to provide land as a collateral, or women farmers who don't have often land as a collateral and then are excluded from getting access to finance. So yeah, there are basically some innovative approaches to do that. For some technologies, because I also work on solar irrigation technologies, there are now some programs that consider the solar pump as the asset. So you don't provide any other collateral. So you get the solar pump, you're trying to pay back, obviously. And if you can't, that pump just goes right back to the provider of the credit. So it can be done for some so-called climate smart technologies. And there's also, again, if these agro dealers, for example, implement a program that directly aims at women farmers. There's some programs that then support them with additional funds, and that those are numeracy, literacy, little programs, capacity building activities with women farmers. So the agro dealer can show that they have reached a larger number of women because they've implemented a bunch of programs. They adjust their credit scores. They adjust the payment payback period following discussions with women farmers. When can they pay back? How can they pay back? If they basically develop a credit scoring scheme and a payback scheme that allows women farmers to be successful in getting credit, then they themselves can get some resources from yet other donors. That could be governments, or it could be NGOs and so forth. So some of these little programs exist. And so, as I said, those could be then bundled with information, with an information intervention. Yeah, I think we definitely need more of those, and we need to do more evaluation, because again, none of them, there's again no panacea, right? They have to be very closely adjusted to the technology or whatever the practice that's being promoted, and they have to be adjusted to the local context. And the key is they have to be flexible, because you might be promoting something, and then let's see, it could be energy intensive, and the energy cost goes up, so it's not interesting, or because energy cost goes up and suddenly there is a big interest. So yeah, because we have the key is, I think, that all of these instruments have to be quite flexible in today's market and climate situation.
Great. We have one comment that says, in our case, women had more access to credit of low value compared to men. Men controlled the means to access larger credit, but most didn't go for it. So overall, women had more access to some finance due to greater group membership. And I think we see this in other places as well, kind of the levels of, it's not just about access to credit, but it's about how much credit you can have. The last question kind of ties back to what I asked you at the beginning, and notes that quite a number of the practices which we now refer to as climate smart ones, like intercropping and broadcasting seeds, have been used by traditional societies, noting that in Kisumu and Siaya, and wondering if that's the case in other places, so that a lot of the traditional practices actually were climate smart, and are those being promoted then as well?
Yeah, I think it's a combination, right? I mean, again, in fact, I think combining indigenous, local, traditional practices with modern practices often leads to the best outcome, right? I mean, let's say we talk generally about integrated soil fertility management. So we know manure is great. It has been applied by everyone everywhere in the world until the chemical fertilizer came along. Now I think what everyone finds is the most productive, the most effective, is to combine the two if you can, right? And one or the other on their own is not effective enough. The manure is not effective enough because you don't have enough cows to go around, and the other one is not effective enough because it's not good enough to retain and grow soil health. And it is correct that now, as you say, a lot of people come from the outside and say, oh, this is the practice you should adopt, and you're like, oh, this is a practice we have been doing forever. And there is still a lack of recognition of the benefits of these long-term indigenous practices. There are also challenges that many indigenous experiences, practices, and knowledge, they don't work anymore because of climate change and climate extremes, right? Actually, we've done a previous study where we had a lot more focus on indigenous practices, and we did here, for example, I think again in Kenya, and that was maybe more in that region, where the farmer said, oh, we use this tree, and whatever, if this tree flowers, it's either going to rain or we can sow or whatever it is. But then it turns out that with climate change, some of, especially, I mean, right? I mean, the climate extreme events and the changes are really accelerating exponentially. So a lot of these traditional knowledge, unfortunately, it's not as effective anymore because those trees are either now dead, or they don't bloom anymore, or they bloom at the wrong time, or they bloom but the rain didn't come so you cannot use everything, right? I mean, many of these indigenous knowledge systems are, and all of them are extremely important, but not all of the indigenous practices and the way, like sowing practices, etc., happened. Unfortunately, some of them don't operate anymore because of climate extremes and climate change. And this is not, this is everywhere in the world, right? I mean, we're like, we should be sowing now, but boom, there's a cold spell, everything freezes. And then that happens in the US as well. It happens in Kenya. So our indigenous knowledge told us you should be doing it now because there were some, as I said, some tree was flowering. But unfortunately, then you get this cold spell and everything freezes and dies. So just to say, we need to understand, cherish, develop, catalog, and use this knowledge more, but we also have to be aware that with climate change and climate extremes, some of those knowledge streams, unfortunately, are not operating, which is why we have, growing risks that farmers now have to deal with. And you have seen, and this reliance on traditional knowledge is it's basically still the largest source of information. Yeah. Just wish it would still work as well as it did before.
Great. Well, thank you, Claudia. We're now out of time. So again, just to say thank you and to remind people that we'll be back with 2 more of these seminars, one in September and one in October. So stay tuned for those. So great.
Yeah. And just thanks for those really great questions. I don't think I've done great justice to all of them, but they're really interesting and open lots more avenues for research that I hope you all will focus on, because this is one problem that's not going away. So I think that's one thing we can say. You invest in research in this area, it will pay off. So thanks so much. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.